Let's say that Brad sells cheap watches, very cheap watches. Let's say that the price of Brad's watches is $5. What would happen if Brad realized that he could sell his watches at $8? Well, Brad would want to make more watches, right? Because he knows that he can make more money from selling watches. In fact, he would choose to make watches over anything else that he could produce. Let's say toothpicks, if he knew that his price for selling those watches would be greater than his price for selling the toothpicks. Seems like it could be very complicated, but if you think about it, it's actually very simple. So simple that it's actually called the law of supply. The law of supply is easy. It states that the higher the cost, the more that producers of the good that producers will supply to the market. It's exactly like our example with Brad, right? If they know they can make more money, they will make more money by producing more of the good. Yeah. Supply is very simple and very similar to demand. And if you haven't watched the video on demand, I would highly suggest going back and watching that. Supply follows the same procedures as demand, except the demand curve is inverse. You still have a supply schedule, a graph that shows the supply. You still have the supply graph, which is a visual representation of the supply schedule. And you still have that ratio between price and quantity. This time, however, it's referred to as the quantity supplied. Much like the quantity demanded, quantity supplied is only affected by a change in price. Nothing else can affect the quantity supplied. However, we do have a different mnemonic for remembering the things that can shift the supply curve. Instead of tribe, which we use for demand, for supply we use rotten. The R for rotten stands for the resources, namely the price of resources. Now, as you'll remember from our video on resources, this can include anything from entrepreneurial resources to land resources to labor resources and so on. If, for example, the union were to agree, let's say Brad owns a company that produces watches for his $5 and $8 watches. If Brad used union workers to create his watches, and the union agreed to pay cuts for Brad's workers, Brad's supply curve for watches would shift to the right. It would increase because Brad could create more watches more profitably because the price of producing a watch went down. The same happens if the price of the fake silver that Brad uses on his watch goes up. The price of the product materials goes up. So Brad's supply curve will shift to the left. His supply curve will decrease because he will have less of an incentive to supply it to the market because he's making less of a profit. O stands for other products, or the complements and substitutes of the product being produced. It's very simple, same as demand. If you have other products that are increasing, if you have a complement that is increasing, you will be more likely to create that good because you know demand for that good is going to be increasing. The first T is for taxes. Usually this is put under the category of taxes and subsidies, which it's mainly supposed to represent any sort of market, governmental influence on the supply. Taxes would reduce the supply curve because it's going to make it more expensive to supply that good to the market. A subsidy is the opposite of a tax. It'll actually make it more lucrative for producers to create and supply these goods to the market. The second T is for technology. Any technology is going to increase the production of the good or service, whether it be reducing the wage costs because you can use robots to start to make your watches, or because it's just easier and simpler to make the watches. So if Brad were to purchase watch building robots, his supply curve would shift to the right because he would be able to supply more at the same cost. Supply more watches to the market at the same cost. E is once again for expectations. The expectations of the future prices of the market. A producer, let's continue using Brad for our example. If Brad knew that the price of watches was going to rise from $8 to $13 in 2 weeks, Brad would want to hoard in on his supply of watches to make sure that in 2 weeks he had even more to supply to the market. Thus, that future expectation of the increase in watch price will lower Brad's supply curve and shift it to the left. However, if Brad thought that the price was going to go from $8 back down to $5, he would not save as many watches, and his supply curve would move to the right because he would be trying to get out as many watches now as he could at the current higher price. The final letter of rotten, N, is really basic logic. It stands for the number of suppliers in the market. And the N basically states that the more people you have putting the good into the market, the more of the good you'll have. Which makes sense, right? So the more players you have creating the good in the market, the higher the demand, the higher the supply will be. Not the demand, the supply. The higher the supply will be, shifting that supply curve far to the right. However, if you don't have a lot of people producing the goods, there are going to be less of those goods in the market, and so the supply curve is going to be far to the left. Supply and demand are actually very similar, and in a future video we're going to seek the interplay between the two. However, it is important to remember that information such as substitutes and complements is going to be given to you on the test. I also cannot stress enough that a change in price can change the quantity supplied. Those two have a direct relationship and nothing else. Any other change, any change to the supply itself, any shift to the supply curve has to be one of those rotten factors. Price cannot shift the supply curve. However, rotten factors cannot shift the quantity supplied. There's a distinct difference, and if you screw that up on the test, you will definitely get called on it. Okay, I will see you next time when we do our video on equilibrium, talking about the interplay between supply and demand. Until next time, this is Duncan driving away from AP Macarnomics.